Welcome to Criminal Nights. Tonight, I'll take you into the shadows of true crime, where the darkness reveals truths that daylight refuses to acknowledge. I'm your host, and for the next hour, you'll walk beside me through corridors of human depravity, where every corner holds a secret and every shadow conceals a sin. Before we dive into tonight's tale of horror, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to Criminal Nights, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because knowing you're out there, somewhere in the darkness with me, makes this journey feel less lonely. Now, let me take you back to October 1987, to a suburban street in Denver, Colorado, where I first learned that evil doesn't always announce itself with screams. Sometimes, it whispers. The Hartwell house sat at the end of Maple Grove Lane, like a festering wound on an otherwise pristine neighborhood. I remember driving past it that first time, my headlights cutting through the autumn fog, and feeling something cold settle in my stomach. The two-story colonial should have been welcoming white picket fence, manicured lawn, children's bicycles scattered on the driveway. Instead, it felt like a mouth ready to swallow anyone foolish enough to step inside. I was 28 then, a rookie detective with the Denver Police Department, still naive enough to believe that monsters looked like monsters. Detective Sarah Chen, my partner, had been working the case for 3 weeks when I was assigned to assist. She picked me up that morning in her unmarked sedan, cigarette smoke curling from her lips like incense for the damned. "You ever work a case involving kids, Martinez?" she asked, her voice gravelly from years of smoking in too many crime scenes. "Missing persons, yeah. A few runaways." I tried to sound confident, but something in her tone made my mouth go dry. "This isn't runaways." She flicked ash out the window. "This is something else entirely." The Hartwell family had been reported missing on October 15th by Margaret's sister, Linda, who hadn't heard from them in over a week. Margaret Hartwell, 34, was an elementary school teacher, beloved by her students. Her husband David, 37, worked as an accountant at a downtown firm. Their children, 8-year-old Emma and 6-year-old Tyler, were the kind of kids who still believed in fairy tales and happy endings. The kind of innocence that makes what happened next feel like a personal violation. When we first entered the house, using the spare key Linda had provided, everything appeared normal to normal. The breakfast dishes were still on the kitchen table for place settings with dried cereal crusted in colorful bowls. Tyler's Spider-Man backpack hung on a chair, his math homework half finished on the counter, his careful second-grade handwriting forming the numbers with touching precision. "Looks like they just ... left," I murmured, running my finger along the dusty dining room table. "That's what bothers me." Chen moved through the house like a predator, her trained eyes catching details I would have missed. No signs of struggle, no evidence of packing. "But look at this." She pointed to the refrigerator, where a family photo was held by a magnet shaped like a sunflower. In the picture, the Hartwell smiled with genuine happiness, David's arm around Margaret's waist, the children grinning with gap-toothed joy. But someone had taken a red pen and drawn careful X's over each face. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Could be the kids," I suggested weakly. "You know how they like to draw on things." Chen's look could have frozen hell with perfect precision. "Look at the pressure, Martinez. This wasn't child's play." As we moved through the house, more disturbing details emerged. In the master bedroom, Margaret's jewelry box sat open, but nothing appeared missing. David's wallet was on the nightstand, credit cards and cash intact. In Emma's room, her beloved stuffed elephant, the one Linda said she never went anywhere without, sat propped against the pillows, its button eyes staring at nothing. But it was Tyler's room that made my skin crawl. The 6-year-old's bedroom. Walls were covered with his artwork. Typical kid stuff, crayon drawings of stick figure families and rainbow houses. But mixed in with the innocent pictures were others, darker ones. Drawings that showed a man with black eyes standing in their backyard. Pictures of their house with red scribbles that could have been blood. And one that made Chen suck in her breath sharply. A drawing of their family, but with additional figures. Shadow people surrounding them, faceless and menacing. "When did he draw these?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. According to Linda, Tyler started having nightmares about 3 months ago. Said there was a man watching their house at night. Chen carefully photographed each disturbing drawing. The parents thought it was just a phase. We interviewed the neighbors next. Mrs. Patterson from across the street, an elderly woman with suspicious eyes and too many cats, told us she'd seen a man in the Hartwells' backyard several times over the past months. Always at dusk, she said, wringing her hands nervously. Tall man, wearing dark clothes. He'd just stand there by the back fence, watching the house. I told Harold we should call the police, but he said I was being paranoid. Can you describe him more specifically? Chen pressed. His face, Mrs. Patterson shuddered. I could never make out his face clearly, but there was something wrong about the way he stood. Too still, like he wasn't quite, human. The mail carrier, Bill Rodriguez, had noticed something else disturbing. The last week or so, before they disappeared, I stopped seeing the kids playing in the yard. The house felt empty, but their cars were always in the driveway. Made me wonder if they were sick or something. As evening approached on that first day, Chen and I returned to the Hartwell house. Something was drawing me back, though I couldn't explain what. The autumn air had turned crisp, and the shadows seemed longer, darker, more hungry. "We're missing something," Chen muttered, lighting another cigarette as we stood on the front porch. That's when I heard it. A sound that made every hair on my body stand at attention. It was coming from inside the house, a soft scratching noise, like fingernails dragging across wood. "Did you hear that?" I whispered. Chen's hand moved instinctively to her service weapon. Yeah. The scratching came again, rhythmic and deliberate. We drew our guns and carefully unlocked the front door. The house felt different now, charged with malevolent energy. The scratching was coming from upstairs, from what sounded like Tyler's room. We climbed the stairs slowly, each creak of the old wood sounding like a gunshot in the silence. The scratching grew louder, more insistent. When we reached Tyler's room, the door was closed. We'd left it open. Chen reached for the handle, her knuckles white against her weapon. The door swung open with a groan that seemed to come from the house itself. Tyler's room was empty, but something had changed. On the wall where his innocent drawings had hung, new artwork appeared. Fresh crayon marks, still waxy and bright. The drawings showed their family again, but this time they weren't alone in their house. A tall, dark figure stood behind each family member, its hands on their shoulders, like a possessive lover. At the bottom of the drawing, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "He took us home." But Tyler wasn't there to have drawn it. Chen's cigarette fell from her lips, landing on the carpet where it smoldered like a tiny warning fire. "We need to get forensics in here, now." The next 3 days blurred together in a haze of interviews, evidence collection, and growing dread. The forensics team found no fingerprints on the new drawing except Tyler's, but Tyler had been missing for over 2 weeks. The crayon used was from Tyler's own box, and handwriting experts confirmed it was his writing. How does a missing child leave fresh artwork in his own bedroom? Dr. Patricia Vance, a child psychologist we consulted, studied Tyler's drawings with growing concern. This level of fear and detail in a 6-year-old's artwork suggests severe trauma. The shadow figures, the themes of being watched and hunted. This child was terrified of something very real. But what about the new drawing? I pressed. How do you explain that? Dr. Vance removed her glasses and rubbed her tired eyes. I can't. In 30 years of practice, I've never seen anything like this. The investigation expanded. We discovered that 3 other families in the Denver metro area had disappeared under similar circumstances over the past 5 years. The Kowalskis in 1985, parents and 2 children, vanished without a trace from their Littleton home. The Williams family in 1984, gone from their Aurora residence, leaving behind a house that neighbors said felt wrong afterward. And the Sandersons in 1983 disappeared from their Westminster home on a Tuesday night. Their dinner still warm on the stove when relatives found them missing. In each case, there were reports of a tall man watching the houses. In each case, there were children's drawings depicting shadow figures. And in each case, the families simply vanished as if they'd never existed at all. The pattern was impossible to ignore, yet impossible to solve. Chen and I worked 8 days, chasing leads that lead nowhere, interviewing witnesses who described a man who seemed more phantom than human. Sleep became elusive, haunted by dreams of empty houses and children's voices calling from somewhere far away. It was on the 7th night of the investigation that everything changed. I was working late at the station, going through the case files for the 100th time, when my phone rang. The caller ID showed the Hartwell house number. My blood turned to ice. The phone line had been disconnected days ago. "Hello," I answered, my voice barely working. Static filled the line, punctuated by what sounded like whispers. Then, clear as crystal, I heard a child's voice. "Detective Martinez. It's Tyler. We're okay, but we can't come home. He won't let us. He says we belong to him now. Tyler, where are you? Who has you?" "In the dark place. The place behind the house. He showed us where all the families go when they get chosen." "Detective Martinez." "Yes, Tyler, I'm here. Don't look for us. He doesn't like it when people look. He gets angry, and when he gets angry, he chooses new families." The line went dead. I sat staring at the phone for 10 minutes before Chen found me. When I told her about the call, she looked at me like I'd lost my mind. "Martinez, that's impossible. The phone line was cut 3 days ago." "Then explain how I just talked to Tyler Hartwell." We drove to the house immediately, our sirens cutting through the midnight silence. But when we arrived, everything was dark and still. The phone line was indeed severed, the house empty and cold. Yet in Tyler's room, another drawing had appeared. This one showed Detective Chen and me standing in front of their house, and behind us, barely visible in crayon shadows, stood the tall, dark figure, watching, waiting. Under the drawing, in Tyler's innocent handwriting, were the words, "He sees you." If this story is chilling you so far, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you never miss another night of true crime with Criminal Nights. The official investigation lasted 3 more months, but unofficially, it consumed the next 5 years of my life. I interviewed psychics and paranormal investigators, consulted with experts in missing persons and cult behavior, followed leads that took me from Denver to Detroit to rural Texas. Nothing. The Hartwell house was eventually sold to a young couple from California who knew nothing of its history. They lasted 6 weeks before moving out, claiming the house felt occupied and that they heard children playing in the yard at night. When no children were there, the house has remained empty for the past decade. The for sale sign has faded and fallen, but the house endures, waiting with the patience of something that knows its purpose. Chen retired in 1992 and moved to Florida, but she still sends me newspaper clippings when families disappear under similar circumstances. Phoenix in 1995, Portland in 1999, Atlanta in 2003. The pattern continues. But the man, the thing that takes them, remains as elusive as smoke. I never had children of my own. How could I, knowing what I know, knowing that somewhere in the darkness, something watches and waits and chooses families like items from a menu. But sometimes, on quiet nights when the wind carries just the right chill, I still get calls from disconnected phone lines. Tyler's voice, a little older now, but still recognizably him, telling me they're okay in the dark place. That the man takes good care of his chosen families. That they're happy in ways they never were in the light. And sometimes, just sometimes, I believe him. The Hartwell case remains officially unsolved. The file sits in a dusty box in the Denver Police Department's cold case archive, marked with a red tab that indicates unusual circumstances. New detectives sometimes ask about it, drawn by the bizarre details and loose ends that refuse to be tied up. I always tell them the same thing. Some cases aren't meant to be solved. Some mysteries are warnings, not puzzles. And some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Last month, I received a postcard with no return address. The front showed a family photo, a man, woman, and 2 children standing in front of a house I didn't recognize. They were smiling, but their eyes held a darkness that no photograph should capture. On the back, in handwriting I recognized after all these years, were 5 words that still make my hands shake. Thank you for not looking. It was signed simply, the Hartwells. As I finish telling you this story tonight, I want you to think about the houses in your neighborhood. The ones that sit a little too quietly, a little too still. The ones where the shadows seem deeper and the silence feels heavy with secrets. Because somewhere out there, families continue to disappear. Children continue to draw pictures of shadow men who watch from the darkness. And phone lines that should be dead continue to carry voices from places that shouldn't exist. Crime 2. The photographer's last frame. Let me take you back to the winter of 1994, to Seattle, Washington, where the rain never seemed to stop, and the shadows grew longer with each passing day. I had transferred from Denver after the Hartwell case, seeking distance from memories that refused to fade. Little did I know that Seattle held horrors that would make the Hartwell house seem like a children's fairy tale. Marcus Delacroix was a name whispered in the art galleries of Pioneer Square, long before he became a household name for all the wrong reasons. A photographer of extraordinary talent, he specialized in what critics called urban decay portraiture, haunting black and white images of homeless individuals, street performers, and society's forgotten souls. His work was beautiful, in the way that only broken things can be beautiful. Each photograph told a story of human suffering elevated to artistic transcendence. The Seattle Art Museum had featured his work twice, and collectors from New York to Los Angeles paid thousands for his limited edition prints. But Marcus Delacroix had a secret that would transform him from celebrated artist to the most wanted man in the Pacific Northwest. I first encountered his work in February 1994, not in a gallery, but in the evidence room of the Seattle Police Department. Detective Ray Morrison, a 20-year veteran with eyes like broken glass, spread 12 photographs across the metal table with the care of a man handling radioactive material. Found these in a storage unit that belongs to our missing persons, he said, his voice carrying the weight of too many unsolved cases. Tell me what you see. The photographs were stunning, each one a masterpiece of composition and lighting. They showed various homeless individuals in what appeared to be abandoned buildings or empty lots. The subjects looked peaceful, almost serene, their eyes closed, as if sleeping. The lighting created an ethereal quality, like religious artwork, depicting saints in their final moments. They're beautiful, I admitted, feeling guilty for appreciating art that might be evidence of something terrible. Look closer, Morrison said, handing me a magnifying glass. When I examined the photographs more carefully, the beauty transformed into something far more sinister. The subjects weren't sleeping, they were dead. The serene expressions were the slack features of corpses. The ethereal lighting was carefully positioned to hide ligature marks, bruising, and other signs of violent death. Jesus Christ, I whispered. 12 photographs. 12 missing persons reported over the past 18 months. All homeless, all last seen in the Pioneer Square area. Morrison's finger traced the edge of one photograph, showing a young woman who couldn't have been older than This is Sarah Chen, No relation to my old partner. Disappeared 3 months ago. Her body was found yesterday in an abandoned warehouse in Georgetown. The warehouse discovery had been accidental. A demolition crew preparing to tear down the building had found Sarah's body in what had once been a dark room. She was posed exactly as she appeared in the photograph, surrounded by professional lighting equipment and photography props. But Sarah wasn't alone. We found 11 more bodies, Morrison continued, his voice barely above a whisper. All posed, all photographed, all arranged like some sick art installation. The bastard turned murder into performance art. The investigation into Marcus Dela revealed a man whose artistic vision had twisted into something monstrous. Born in New Orleans in 1961, he had shown early talent for photography, winning awards throughout high school and college. He moved to Seattle in 1989, drawn by the city's thriving art scene and abundant population of potential subjects. His early work was legitimately powerful portraits of homeless individuals that captured their humanity while highlighting society's neglect. Gallery owners and critics praised his ability to find beauty in desperation, hope in hopelessness. But somewhere along the way, Marcus began to see his subjects not as people, but as raw material. Dr. Elizabeth Morgan, a forensic psychiatrist who studied the case, explained it to me this way. Delacroix suffered from what we call artistic, narcissistic personality disorder with psychopathic tendencies. He began to see himself as above moral law, justified in his actions by his artistic vision. To him, these weren't murders, they were collaborations. The investigation revealed Delacroix's method with horrifying clarity. He would approach homeless individuals in Pioneer Square, offering them food, money, and shelter in exchange for modeling for his photographs. Many were drug addicts, desperate enough to trust a well-dressed man with expensive equipment and promises of payment. He would take them to various locations around the city, abandoned buildings, empty warehouses, secluded parks. Initially, the photo sessions were legitimate, and several surviving subjects confirmed that Delacroix had paid them as promised and treated them with apparent kindness. But at some point, his artistic vision demanded something more permanent. The forensic evidence suggested that Delacroix would drug his victims with a combination of heroin and sedatives, creating a peaceful, almost euphoric state before strangling them with piano wire. The ligature marks were carefully hidden by strategic lighting and pose positioning in his photographs. He wasn't just killing them, Morrison explained as we stood in the warehouse where the bodies were found. He was creating art. Look at how carefully everything is arranged. The warehouse had been transformed into a studio of death. Professional lighting equipment worth thousands of dollars illuminated 12 stations, each one meticulously arranged with props, backdrops, and positioning aids. The victims had been posed with artistic precision, hands positioned just so, faces angled to catch the light, clothing arranged to create visual flow. It was beautiful and absolutely horrifying. But the most disturbing discovery came when we searched Delacroix's apartment in the Belltown district. Hidden behind a false wall in his dark room, we found his true masterpiece, a collection of over 300 photographs, documenting his crimes in detail. These weren't the artistic portraits found in the warehouse. These were clinical documentation, photographs showing every stage of his process. The initial meeting with victims, the photo sessions, the drugging, the murders, the posing of bodies, the final artistic photographs. And mixed in with the crime scene documentation were photographs of something else entirely, images of Delacroix himself with his victims, smiling like a proud parent with his children. He documented everything, I said, my stomach churning as I flipped through image after image of calculated murder. Gets worse, Morrison replied, pointing to a photo album labeled Future Projects. Inside were surveillance photographs of dozens of homeless individuals around Seattle, each marked with notes about lighting conditions, optimal locations, and artistic potential. Marcus Delacroix had been planning an entire gallery exhibition of murder. The manhunt for Delacroix consumed 3 weeks and involved law enforcement agencies across the Pacific Northwest. His photograph was distributed to every police department, homeless shelter, and social service agency in Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. He was spotted twice, once in Portland, Oregon, attempting to approach a homeless veteran near the Burnside Bridge, and again in Vancouver, Canada, purchasing camera equipment from a photography supply store. But it was in the small coastal town of Bandon, Oregon, that Delacroix's killing spree finally came to an end. Local Sheriff's Deputy Maria Santos was conducting a routine patrol of the town's beach access areas when she noticed a man with expensive photography equipment approaching a transient camp hidden in the dunes. The man matched Delacroix's description perfectly, and Santos called for backup while maintaining surveillance. What she witnessed next would haunt her for the rest of her career. Delacroix had approached a homeless man named Robert Tully, a 63-year-old Vietnam veteran who had been living rough for the past 5 years. Using his practiced method, Delacroix offered Tully food and money in exchange for participating in a photo session on the beach at sunset. Santos watched through binoculars as Delacroix set up his equipment with the same meticulous care he had shown in Seattle. Professional lights, reflectors, camera positioned at the perfect angle to catch the dying light over the Pacific Ocean. But Robert Tully was not like Delacroix's previous victims. 20-5 years of military service and 5 years of street survival had given Tully instincts that kicked in the moment Delacroix offered him a bottled water laced with drugs. Instead of drinking it, Tully pretended to accept it gratefully while secretly pouring it into the sand. When Delacroix approached with the piano wire hidden behind his camera, Tully was ready. "I heard the commotion from half a mile away," Santos told me later. "Screaming, crashing equipment, sounds of a fight. By the time backup arrived, it was over." She found Delacroix face down in the sand, his own piano wire wrapped around his throat, pulled tight by hands that remembered how to kill when necessary. Robert Tully stood over him, shaking with adrenaline and 30 years of suppressed rage. "He tried to drug me," Tully said, his voice steady, despite the tremor in his hands. "Then he came at me with that wire." I recognized the look in his eyes, seen it before in Nam, the look of someone who enjoys killing. Marcus Delacroix died on that Oregon beach, surrounded by his scattered photography equipment and the Pacific Ocean's endless whispers. His final photograph, found in his camera, showed Robert Tully smiling peacefully in the golden hour light, unaware of how close he had come to becoming another piece in Delacroix's gallery of death. If you're still with us after hearing about this monster's twisted artistry, hit that subscribe button, because Criminal Nights has more stories that will make you question the darkness that can hide behind creative genius. The investigation into Delacroix's crimes revealed a network of artistic accomplices who had unknowingly aided his murders. Gallery owners who had displayed his work without questioning the serene expressions of his subjects. Art critics who had praised his ability to capture the peaceful surrender of society's outcasts. Collectors who had paid thousands for what they believed were powerful social commentary pieces. None of them knew they were buying photographs of murder victims. The Seattle Art Museum held a private ceremony to destroy all of Delacroix's work in their collection. The photographs were burned in the museum's courtyard, their smoke rising into the gray Seattle sky like prayers for the dead. But not all of his work was destroyed. 3 months after Delacroix's death, rumors began circulating in Seattle's underground art scene about a private collector who was willing to pay enormous sums for the photographer's lost works. Despite law enforcement's efforts to account for all of Delacroix's photographs, several pieces remained unaccounted for. Dr. Morgan warned us about this possibility. There will always be people who find beauty in evil, who see artistic value in human suffering. Delacroix's work will become legendary precisely because of its horrific nature. She was right. Even today, nearly 30 years later, I occasionally receive reports of Delacroix photographs surfacing in private collections or underground auctions. Each time, law enforcement seizes the images as evidence of murder, but like a cancer, they continue to spread. Robert Tully, the man who ended Delacroix's killing spree, never recovered from the encounter. The trauma of nearly becoming a victim, combined with years of untreated PTSD from Vietnam, led to a complete mental breakdown 6 months later. He died in a VA psychiatric facility in 1996, taking his own life with a length of rope that he had somehow fashioned into a noose. His suicide note contained a single line, "I can still see his camera watching me." The homeless community in Seattle was forever changed by the Delacroix murders. Trust, already scarce among society's most vulnerable population, became nearly extinct. Legitimate social workers and outreach programs found their efforts hampered by fear. Who could tell the difference between someone offering genuine help and someone offering artistic collaboration? Even now, homeless advocates in Seattle report that members of their community sometimes refuse to have their photographs taken for identification purposes or social service documentation. The fear that Marcus Delacroix instilled in his victims echoes through generations of forgotten souls. But perhaps the most disturbing legacy of the Delacroix case was what it revealed about our society's relationship with art and suffering. Gallery visitors had looked at photographs of murder victims and seen beauty. Critics had praised compositions that featured the final moments of human lives. Collectors had paid thousands for images of death, never questioning why the subjects looked so peaceful. How many other artists, I wondered, might be hiding similar secrets behind their creative work? How many galleries display horrors disguised as beauty? How many collectors unknowingly treasure images of human suffering? These questions haunted me long after the case was officially closed. They drove me to investigate other artists whose work featured unusually realistic depictions of death or violence. They made me suspicious of any photographer who specialized in found subjects or worked exclusively with society's most vulnerable populations. Most of my investigations led nowhere. The vast majority of artists, even those who work with dark themes, are simply exploring the human condition through their chosen medium. But occasionally, very occasionally, I would find something that made my blood run cold. A sculptor in Portland, whose realistic death masks were perhaps too realistic. A painter in San Francisco whose models for murder scenes were never identified. A filmmaker in Los Angeles whose snuff film allegations were dismissed as publicity stunts. Each investigation reminded me that the line between art and evil can be thinner than we want to believe. That creativity and cruelty can coexist in the same mind, feeding off each other until the distinction between artistic vision and murderous obsession disappears entirely. The Delacroix case files still sit in my home office, in a locked cabinet that I rarely open. But sometimes, on nights when sleep refuses to come, I find myself looking through those photographs again, trying to see what the critics saw, trying to understand how beauty could emerge from such calculated evil. And I always come to the same conclusion. There was no beauty there. There was only death, dressed up in professional lighting and artistic composition. The real beauty lay in the lives that were stolen. Sarah Chen's dreams of someday reuniting with her family. Robert Tully's hope of finding peace after decades of war. And 10 other souls whose stories ended in a Seattle warehouse at the hands of a man who confused murder with art. If you've stayed with us through this dark exploration of artistic evil, leave a comment with the word frame so we know you're brave enough to face these uncomfortable truths with us. Marcus Delacroix believed that his photographs would make him immortal, that his artistic vision would outlive his physical form. In a twisted way, he was right. His name lives on in criminal psychology textbooks, FBI behavioral analysis courses, and cautionary tales told in art schools across the country. But the immortality he achieved was not the kind he desired. He's remembered not as a visionary artist, but as a reminder that the human capacity for evil can disguise itself in beautiful and sophisticated forms. His legacy is not one of artistic triumph, but of the vulnerable lives he stole and the trust he shattered. And in the end, his final photograph, that last image of Robert Tully smiling in the golden light, serves as a monument, not to his artistic vision, but to the strength of a survivor who refused to become another piece in a killer's gallery. Until next time, this has been another night with Criminal Nights. Remember that true art celebrates life, not death, and that the most beautiful photographs are those that capture genuine human joy, not manufactured peace. Crime 3, The Silence of Room 237. Let me take you to 1998, to St. Catherine's Care Facility, in rural Maine, where the autumn leaves fell like bloodstains on the ground and the screams were mistaken for the wind through old windows. I arrived at St. Catherine's on a Thursday morning that felt more like twilight, the sky pregnant with storm clouds that seemed to press down on the Victorian-era building like a giant's palm. The facility had once been a mansion, built by a railroad baron in 1892. Its Gothic architecture, all sharp angles and leering gargoyles. When the family fortune collapsed during the Great Depression, it was converted into a care facility for the elderly and infirm. By 1998, it housed 43 residents, all suffering from various stages of dementia, Alzheimer's, and other conditions that robbed them of their voices, long before death claimed their bodies, which made it the perfect hunting ground for someone like Nurse Patricia Henley. The call had come to the Maine State Police at 6:47 a.m. from Dr. James Crawford, St. Catherine's medical director. His voice shook so badly over the phone that the dispatcher initially thought he was having a stroke. "We need help," he whispered into the receiver. "Something terrible has been happening here. Something that should be impossible." I was the closest detective when the call came in, driving through the pine forests of central Maine on my way to investigate a routine insurance fraud case. Little did I know that I was about to encounter something that would make Marcus Delacour's photography studio seem like a children's playroom. Dr. Crawford met me at the front entrance, his usually pristine white coat stained with what looked like coffee but smelled like vomit. He was a man in his 60s, with the kind of gentle eyes that spoke of a lifetime spent caring for others. But those eyes now held something I had seen too many times before, the haunted look of someone who had stared into the abyss and found it staring back. "Detective Martinez," he said, his voice barely audible over the wind that howled through the facility's ancient eaves. "Thank God you're here. I don't know how to, I can't even begin to explain." "Try," I said, pulling out my notebook, though something in the air made my hands shake as I wrote. "It's Patricia," he whispered, looking over his shoulder, as if afraid she might appear at any moment. "Nurse Henley. She's been, she's been hurting them." Patricia Henley had worked at St. Catherine's for 7 years, arriving in 1991 with impeccable references from facilities in Florida and Georgia. She was 42 years old, unmarried, and dedicated to her patients with what seemed like supernatural devotion. She worked double shifts without complaint, stayed late to comfort distressed residents, and volunteered for weekend duty when other staff wanted time off. The residents loved her. Their families praised her. Dr. Crawford had recommended her for Employee of the Year 3 times, but Dr. Crawford had begun to notice disturbing patterns in recent months. "The death rate," he explained as we walked through corridors lined with faded wallpaper and portraits of long-dead benefactors. "It's been climbing steadily. We lost 12 residents in the past 6 months. That's triple our normal rate." "Natural causes?" I asked, though something in his expression told me the answer. That's what I thought. These are elderly people with serious health conditions. Death is expected. He stopped walking and gripped my arm with surprising strength. But then I started noticing other things. The other things Dr. Crawford noticed painted a picture that made my skin crawl. Residents who had been relatively stable suddenly developing mysterious symptoms. Medications that went missing from secure storage. and most disturbing of all, sounds coming from room 237 in the middle of the night. Room 237 houses our most advanced dementia patients, Dr. Crawford explained as we approached the end of a dimly lit hallway. 4 beds, 4 residents who can barely remember their own names, let alone communicate what's happening to them. The door to room 237 stood slightly ajar, and through the gap, I could see 4 hospital beds, arranged with military precision. The room was spotlessly clean, almost sterile, but there was something wrong with the light. It seemed to bend and shift in ways that made my eyes water. "What kind of sounds?" I asked. Dr. Crawford's face went white, crying, whimpering, sometimes what sounded like begging, though our residents haven't been capable of coherent speech in years. "When did you first notice these sounds?" "About 3 months ago. Always between 2 and 4 a.m., always when Patricia was working the night shift alone." He wiped sweat from his forehead, despite the autumn chill. I thought it was my imagination. At first, old buildings make strange noises, but then other staff started mentioning it too. The investigation that followed would reveal horrors that challenged everything I thought I knew about human evil. But it began with a simple request from Dr. Crawford. Would I mind staying overnight to observe the night shift routine? I agreed, though every instinct screamed at me to leave this place and never return. That night, I positioned myself in an empty office with a clear view of the hallway leading to room 237. The facility settled into its nighttime rhythm, distant sounds of televisions, occasional calls from confused residents, the soft squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum floors. Patricia Henley began her shift at 11 p.m. with the same professional competence Dr. Crawford had described. She checked on each resident, administered medications according to their charts, and maintained detailed notes about their conditions. Everything appeared normal until 2:17 a.m. That's when Patricia made her way to room 237. Wheeling a cart loaded with medical supplies that seemed far more extensive than necessary for routine patient care, she entered the room and closed the door behind her with the careful quiet of someone who didn't want to be disturbed. For 20 minutes, the hallway remained silent. Then, faintly at first, I began to hear sounds that made my blood run cold. Whimpering, soft crying, and underneath it all, a voice, Patricia's voice, speaking in soothing tones that somehow made the sounds more terrifying, not less. "She, Mr. Garrison, this will only hurt for a little while. You won't remember it anyway." I called for backup and slowly approached room 237. Through the gap under the door, I could see shadows moving in ways that suggested struggle, though the residents in that room were supposedly too far gone to resist anything. What I found when I opened that door will haunt me until the day I die. Patricia Henley stood over the bed of Harold Garrison, an 81-year-old man with advanced Alzheimer's who hadn't spoken in 3 years. She held a syringe filled with clear liquid, and Harold's arms were covered with fresh needle marks that formed an almost geometric pattern across his withered skin. But Harold wasn't unconscious. His eyes were wide with terror, tears streaming down his face, and his mouth moved in soundless screams. The other 3 residents in the room were in similar states, conscious, aware, and absolutely terrified, but unable to speak or call for help. "Step away from the patient," I commanded, drawing my weapon. Patricia turned slowly, and for a moment I saw something in her eyes that I had never seen before. Not just madness, but a kind of scientific curiosity, as if I were an interesting specimen that had wandered into her laboratory. "You don't understand," she said calmly, still holding the syringe. "They can't feel pain the way we do. Their brains are damaged. I'm helping them experience sensation again. Put down the syringe." She smiled, and that smile contained more evil than I had seen in a lifetime of chasing killers. "You think I'm hurting them, but look at their eyes. Really look. When was the last time you saw someone with Alzheimer's look so, alive? She was, right? and that made it infinitely worse. The residents in room 237 weren't just conscious, they were hyper-aware. Their damaged brains somehow firing with an intensity that made their eyes burn with recognition and terror. What did you give them? A cocktail of my own design? Amphetamines? Adrenaline? A touch of LSD? It cuts through the fog of dementia like sunlight through clouds. She gestured proudly at her victims. For a few hours, they remember everything. Their names, their families, their fears, and then they remember what I've been doing to them. If this story is making you question everything you thought you knew about the people we trust with our most vulnerable loved ones, make sure you hit that subscribe button, because Criminal Nights is just getting started with this nightmare. The investigation into Patricia Henley's crimes revealed a level of systematic torture that defied comprehension. Hidden cameras, installed in her apartment after her arrest, showed hundreds of hours of footage documenting her experiments on dementia patients over the course of 7 years. She had been using the residence of St. Catherine's as laboratory rats, testing different combinations of drugs to see how they affected damaged brains. Some experiments involved pain tolerance. How much agony could a person with Alzheimer's endure before their damaged neural pathways shut down? Others focused on memory restoration. Could extreme trauma force broken minds to remember forgotten experiences? The most horrifying discovery was her detailed journal, written in the precise handwriting of a medical professional documenting scientific research. Each entry described a different subject, their baseline condition, the drugs administered, and the results observed. Entry number 247. Subject H.G. Harold Garrison. Administered cocktail 7.3 at 0215 hours. Subject achieved full consciousness within 6 minutes. Recognition of environment in situation evident through increased heart rate and pupil dilation. Subject attempted vocalization, but laryngeal damage prevents coherent speech. Applied electrical stimulus to extremities for 45 minutes. Subject remained conscious throughout procedure. Memory functions appear to be temporarily restored based on appropriate fear responses to familiar instruments. There were over 400 such entries. Dr. Margaret Foster, a forensic psychiatrist who evaluated Patricia after her arrest, struggled to classify her mental state. She displays characteristics of antisocial personality disorder, but with an unusual twist, Dr. Foster explained. She genuinely believes her actions were scientifically valuable. She sees herself as a researcher, not a torturer. How is that possible? I asked. She's compartmentalized her behavior into clinical detachment. To her, these weren't people, they were damaged biological specimens that she was studying. The fact that they suffered was irrelevant, because, in her mind, they weren't fully human anymore. The scope of Patricia's crimes became clear as we interviewed other staff members and reviewed medical records. 17 residents had died under suspicious circumstances during her tenure, all showing signs of unexplained trauma that had been attributed to complications from their underlying conditions. But the living victims told an even more horrifying story. When Patricia's drug cocktails wore off, the residents would return to their dementia-induced fog, unable to remember or communicate what had happened to them. But their bodies remembered. They would become agitated when Patricia approached, exhibit signs of extreme stress during her shifts, and display traumatic responses to medical equipment that they had previously tolerated without issue. Their damaged minds couldn't hold the memories, but their nervous systems had been permanently scarred by repeated trauma. "It's the perfect crime," said Dr. Crawford, his voice hollow with guilt. She chose victims who couldn't report what was happening to them, couldn't remember it clearly, and couldn't be believed if they tried to communicate. Who would take seriously the claims of someone with severe dementia? The answer, unfortunately, was no one. Family members who had noticed their loved ones seeming more agitated or distressed were told it was a normal progression of their disease. Staff members who heard unusual sounds were assured it was nothing to worry about. Even Dr. Crawford had initially dismissed the evidence as coincidence or imagination. Patricia Henley's trial became a media sensation, but not for the reasons you might expect. Instead of focusing on her crimes, much of the coverage centered on the ethical questions her case raised about dementia care and patient autonomy. Defense attorneys argued that her victims weren't competent to consent to or refuse treatment, and therefore, Patricia's actions, while unorthodox, were within the scope of medical experimentation. They claimed she was trying to develop new treatments for cognitive decline, and that her methods, while aggressive, were motivated by compassion. Cedar Hollow was the kind of town that appeared on postcards, population 3,847, surrounded by rolling hills that turned gold in autumn and emerald in spring. Main Street was lined with antique shops, a single movie theater that still showed, double features, and Millie's Diner, where everyone knew your order before you sat down. It was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors, where children rode their bikes until streetlights came on, and where everyone trusted everyone else because they'd known each other since childhood, which made it the perfect hunting ground for someone like Thomas Ashford. I arrived in Cedar Hollow on a Tuesday morning in July, the air thick with humidity and the sweet smell of wild roses. The Vermont State Police had called me in after receiving reports that would shatter this small town's innocence forever. The reports came from Dr. Alina Rodriguez, a child psychologist who had been contracted by Cedar Hollow Elementary School to work with students displaying behavioral problems. What she discovered in her sessions would expose a network of abuse so systematic and widespread that it challenged everything the townspeople believed about their community. Detective Martinez, Dr. Rodriguez said, as we sat in the school's empty library, surrounded by bright bulletin boards and children's artwork that now felt obscenely cheerful, I need you to understand something before I show you these files. What I'm about to share with you will change how you see this town, these families, and possibly how you see humanity itself. She was a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes that had clearly seen too much suffering. Her hands shook slightly as she opened a thick manila folder filled with children's drawings and psychological evaluations. It started with Sarah Chen, she continued. 8 years old, 2nd grade. Her teacher referred her to me because she'd been acting out sudden aggression, inappropriate sexual knowledge, nightmares that made her afraid to sleep. Sarah's drawings covered the table like evidence from a crime scene, which in many ways, they were. Crayon pictures that showed stick figures engaged in acts no child should know about, houses with secret rooms, and adults with exaggerated features that suggested power and menace. The imagery was disturbing, Dr. Rodriguez explained, but what really alarmed me was the consistency. Sarah wasn't drawing random violent or sexual content. She was documenting specific experiences with photographic accuracy. What did she tell you? At first, nothing. These children are trained not to speak about what happens to them. But gradually, through play therapy and careful questioning, Sarah began to reveal details about something she called the Special Club. The Special Club, as Sarah described it, met in the basement of Thomas Ashford's Victorian house on Elm Street. Thomas was 62 years old, a retired high school principal who had lived in Cedar Hollow his entire life. He was beloved in the community, a pillar of the Methodist Church, organizer of the annual 4th of July parade, and volunteer reading tutor at the elementary school. He was also, according to Sarah's testimony, the leader of a pedophile ring that had been operating in Cedar Hollow for over 15 years. The children called him Uncle Tommy, Dr. Rodriguez said, her voice barely above a whisper. He would recruit them through the reading program, identifying vulnerable kids, those from broken homes, children with absent parents, kids who were hungry for adult attention and approval. Thomas Ashford's method was as methodical as it was evil. He would target children between the ages of 6 and 10, always those who seemed isolated or neglected. He would begin by offering special tutoring sessions at his home, with parental permission. of course. The sessions started innocently, reading lessons, help with homework, cookies and milk in his cozy kitchen. But gradually, the sessions would change. He would introduce concepts of special friendship, Dr. Rodriguez explained. Games that were just between them, secrets that made the children feel important and chosen. He was grooming them with textbook precision. The basement of Thomas's house had been converted into what he called the reading room, a comfortable space with beanbag chairs, soft lighting, and shelves lined with children's books. But hidden behind a false wall was another room entirely, one equipped with cameras, recording equipment, and props for acts that I cannot and will not describe in detail. The children weren't just being abused, Dr. Rodriguez continued, her professional composure cracking. They were being filmed. Thomas was producing and distributing child pornography on an industrial scale. As Sarah's story unfolded through weeks of careful therapy, other details emerged that made the scope of the horror clear. Thomas didn't work alone. The special club included other respected members of the Cedar Hollow community, men who used their positions of trust to identify and recruit victims. There was a network, Dr. Rodriguez said, the elementary school janitor who would identify which children seemed neglected, the youth pastor at the Baptist church who would recommend certain kids for special mentoring, the owner of the local toy store who would give gifts to children whose parents couldn't afford much. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Sarah Mitchell, had to prove that torture disguised as research was still torture, regardless of the victim's mental state. Patricia Henley didn't see her patients as human beings, Mitchell argued in her closing statement. She saw them as laboratory animals. The fact that they couldn't advocate for themselves didn't make her actions acceptable. It made them monstrous. The jury deliberated for 6 days. When they returned with a guilty verdict on 17 counts of murder and 43 counts of aggravated assault, Patricia showed no emotion. She sat in the defendant's chair with the same clinical detachment she had displayed while torturing her victims, taking notes about the proceedings as if they were simply another experiment to document. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. But even that felt insufficient, given the scope of her crimes. Seen Catherine's care facility closed 6 months after Patricia's conviction. The building stood empty for 3 years before being demolished. But even now, 25 years later, locals report strange sounds coming from the empty lot where it once stood, soft crying that might be wind through the trees, or might be something else entirely. The surviving victims were transferred to other facilities, where they continued to display the traumatic responses. Patricia's experiments burned into their nervous systems. They flinch when approached by medical staff, become agitated during routine procedures, and sometimes, in moments of brief clarity that punch through their dementia, they speak a single word that chills everyone who hears it: Patricia. But perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Patricia Henley case wasn't the crimes themselves, but what they revealed about our society's treatment of its most vulnerable members. How many other Patricia Henleys are working in care facilities across the country, hidden behind professional credentials and institutional trust? How many residents suffer in silence because their damaged minds can't hold on to the memories of their abuse long enough to report it? The questions haunted me long after the case closed, driving me to investigate similar facilities across New England. I never found another Patricia Henley, but I found evidence of neglect so severe it bordered on torture. Residents left in soiled bedding for hours, medications withheld to make staff duties easier, and elderly people treated like inconveniences rather than human beings. Each investigation reminded me that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they wear scrubs and carry stethoscopes. Sometimes they smile kindly at family members while committing atrocities in private. Sometimes they hide behind the very institutions we trust to protect those who can no longer protect themselves. The families of Patricia's victims filed a class action lawsuit against St. Catherine's, claiming the facility should have detected and prevented her crimes. The case settled out of court for an undisclosed amount, but no amount of money could undo the years of systematic torture their loved ones endured. Mrs. Eleanor Garrison, Harold's daughter, spoke at Patricia's sentencing hearing. Her words still echo in my mind. My father fought in World War II. He survived the Battle of the Bulge, came home, raised 4 children, and worked for 40 years to build a life for his family. He deserved to spend his final years in peace and dignity. Instead, he spent them being tortured by someone who was supposed to care for him. The disease took his mind, but Patricia Henley took his humanity. Harold Garrison died 2 years after Patricia's conviction, his body finally succumbing to the cumulative trauma of her experiments. His death certificate listed complications from Alzheimer's disease as the cause of death. But everyone who knew the case understood the real truth. He died from systematic torture that his damaged brain couldn't process or forget. In prison, Patricia Henley has become something of a celebrity among criminal psychology researchers. She grants interviews to graduate students studying the intersection of medical authority and psychopathy, discussing her crimes with the same clinical detachment she displayed during her trial. She has shown no remorse, no recognition that her actions were wrong, and no understanding of why society considers her a monster rather than a misunderstood researcher. In her mind, she was advancing medical science, pushing the boundaries of what we know about consciousness and memory. Even now, she continues to write in her journal, documenting her observations about prison life, the behavior of guards and inmates, and her theories about criminal rehabilitation. She treats incarceration as simply another research opportunity, another chance to study human behavior under controlled conditions. The Patricia Henley case changed how I approach every investigation involving institutional care. It taught me that evil can flourish in places designed for healing, that monsters can hide behind compassionate facades, and that our most vulnerable citizens often suffer in silence because society has already decided their voices don't matter. If you've managed to stay with us through this descent into institutional horror, leave a comment with the word silence so we know you understand why these stories need to be told, even when they make us question everything we thought we could trust. But more importantly, remember that for every Patricia Henley who uses her position to inflict suffering, there are thousands of genuine caregivers who dedicate their lives to providing comfort and dignity to those who need it most. The tragedy isn't just that Patricia existed, but that her actions cast suspicion on the truly compassionate people who chose to work with society's most vulnerable members. The residents of room 237 are gone now, their suffering finally ended by the mercy of death. But somewhere tonight, in care facilities across the world, other vulnerable souls lie in beds similar to theirs, trusting that the people responsible for their care will treat them with humanity and respect. For their sake, we must remain vigilant. We must ask the hard questions, investigate the suspicious patterns, and never assume that professional credentials guarantee moral character, because sometimes the people we trust to heal are the very ones who hurt the most. Until next time, this has been another journey into darkness with Criminal Nights. Check on your elderly relatives and friends. Ask questions about their care. And remember that silence isn't always golden. Sometimes it's the sound of suffering that no one is willing to hear. Crimes. 4. The Children of Cedar Hollow. Let me take you back to the summer of 2003, to the small town of Cedar Hollow, Vermont, where the maple trees whispered secrets that should never have been spoken, and where I learned that evil can wear the most trusted faces in our community. Each man played a specific role in what amounted to an organized conspiracy to sexually exploit the children of Cedar Hollow. They shared victims, traded photographs and videos, and covered for each other when suspicions arose. How many children? I asked. though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. We've identified 37 victims so far, ranging in age from 5 to 12. But based on the evidence we've recovered, ... She paused, struggling to maintain her composure. We believe there may be as many as 60 children who were abused over the past 15 years. The investigation that followed was unlike anything I had experienced in my career. Working with federal agents and child protection services, we began the delicate process of interviewing potential victims and gathering evidence against the perpetrators. But investigating child abuse cases in a small town presents unique challenges. These weren't strangers who had harmed the children. They were trusted community members, friends and neighbors who had been invited into homes and hearts for years. The first arrest was Thomas Ashford himself. When we executed the search warrant on his house, we found a basement that had been converted into a factory for producing child exploitation material. Professional lighting equipment, multiple cameras, editing software, and a distribution network that reached across the country and around the world. "Look at this," Agent Sarah Kim from the FBI's Crimes Against Children unit said, gesturing to a wall covered with photographs. He documented every victim, every session. It's like he was collecting trophies. The photographs showed dozens of children over the years, their faces a progression of innocence lost and trust betrayed. Some were recent kids I recognized from our interviews. Others were older, showing children who were now teenagers or young adults, living with the buried trauma of what had been done to them. But the most chilling discovery was Thomas's journal, a detailed record of his crimes written with the pride of someone documenting his life's work. July 15, 2001, introduced Amy K. to the special room today. She was initially resistant but responded well to the reward system. Recorded session number 247. Quality, excellent for distribution. September 3, 2002. Michael R. has been asking questions about why the sessions are secret. May need to accelerate timeline with him before he becomes a liability. March 12, 2003. Identified new potential recruit through the church program. Jessica M. Age 7. Single mother working 2 jobs. Perfect candidate for special attention. Each entry was written in neat handwriting, with the clinical detachment of someone documenting a business transaction, rather than describing the systematic abuse of children. If this story is making you physically ill, I understand, but please, stay with us and hit that subscribe button, because these are the stories that need to be told. The horrors that need to be exposed so they can never happen again. As the investigation expanded, we identified 4 other men involved in the ring. Donald Pierce, 54, the elementary school janitor who had worked at the school for 12 years. He used his position to identify vulnerable children and would often suggest to teachers that certain students might benefit from extra help from volunteer tutors like Thomas. Reverend Michael Hayes, 48, youth pastor at Cedar Hollow Baptist Church. He ran after-school programs and summer camps that gave him unsupervised access to children from religious families who trusted him implicitly. Carl Morrison, 39, owner of Morrison's Toy and Game Shop on Main Street. He would identify children whose families struggled financially and would offer them special deals or free toys in exchange for helping him with inventory in his store's back room. And David Chen, 51, a respected attorney who lived in one of Cedar Hollow's most expensive homes. He used his legal knowledge to help the ring avoid detection and his professional connections to identify children involved in custody disputes who might be particularly vulnerable to adult manipulation. Each arrest sent shockwaves through the community. These weren't outsiders or obvious predators. They were pillars of Cedar Hollow society. Men who had coached Little League teams, organized charity drives, and been invited to countless family gatherings. The town's reaction was as disturbing as the crimes themselves. Many residents refused to believe the accusations, despite overwhelming evidence. They organized protests outside the courthouse, claiming the men were being framed by overzealous prosecutors. They raised money for legal defense funds and wore ribbons supporting the accused. "These are good Christian men," declared Martha Whitfield, president of the Cedar Hollow Ladies Auxiliary. "This is nothing but a witch hunt designed to destroy our community." Meanwhile, the victims and their families faced suspicion and blame. Several families received threatening phone calls telling them to stop lying about good people. One mother found her car tires slashed after her son testified before the grand jury. Another family was forced to move after their house was vandalized, with graffiti calling them traitors. The children caught in the middle suffered the most. They're being victimized twice, Dr. Rodriguez explained during one of our regular case conferences. First by their abusers, and now by a community that refuses to accept the truth about what happened to them. The trial phase lasted nearly 2 years, as prosecutors worked to present evidence, so overwhelming that even the most skeptical jurors couldn't deny the reality of what had occurred. Video evidence, DNA analysis, financial records showing payments for child exploitation material, and the testimony of dozens of victims painted a picture of systematic abuse that had flourished under the protection of community trust. Thomas Ashford, faced with irrefutable evidence, eventually accepted a plea bargain that would spare him the death penalty in exchange for cooperation with investigators. His testimony revealed details about the ring's operation that were so systematic and widespread that federal prosecutors compared it to organized crime. "We weren't just abusing children," Thomas said during his confession, speaking with the same matter-of-fact tone he might have used to describe organizing a school fundraiser. "We were running a business. The videos we produced were sold internationally. We had clients in Europe, Asia, Australia. What we did here in Cedar Hollow was just the production side of a global enterprise." The financial records seized from Thomas's house revealed that the ring had generated over $2 million in revenue from selling child exploitation material over 15 years. The money had been used to purchase better equipment, fund recruiting activities, and pay for the silence of anyone who might have suspected what was happening. Donald Pierce received 25 years in federal prison. Reverend Hayes was sentenced to 30 years. Carl Morrison got 22 years. David Chen, as the ring's legal advisor and money launderer, received 40 years. Thomas Ashford was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. At his sentencing hearing, he was given the opportunity to address the court. "I want to apologize to the families," he said, his voice steady and controlled. "But I also want them to understand that what we did wasn't motivated by cruelty. We genuinely cared about these children. We provided them with attention and affection they weren't getting at home. Yes, our methods were unconventional, but our intentions were always to show these kids that they were special and loved." Even in confession, even facing life in prison, Thomas Ashford couldn't or wouldn't acknowledge that what he had done was right. To him, it remained unconventional care and special affection. The aftermath of the Cedar Hollow case continued long after the trials ended. 30-7 identified victims meant 37 shattered childhoods, 37 families dealing with unimaginable trauma, and 37 young people whose trust in adults had been permanently broken. Many required years of therapy. Several developed eating disorders, substance abuse problems, and difficulty forming healthy relationships. 3 of the victims attempted suicide before their 18th birthdays. The town itself never recovered. Cedar Hollow's population dropped by nearly a third as families moved away, unable to remain in a place where their children had been so systematically betrayed. Local businesses closed as tourism dried up and residents lost faith in their community. Institutions. The elementary school was eventually demolished and rebuilt in a different location, but enrollment remained low as many families chose to send their children to schools in neighboring towns rather than risk exposure to whatever institutional failures had allowed the abuse to continue for so long. Cedar Hollow Methodist Church, where Thomas had been a deacon for over 20 years, closed its doors permanently in 2005. The building stands empty now, its windows boarded up and its bell tower silent, a monument to the congregation's collective failure to protect the children in their care. But perhaps the most lasting damage was done to the concept of community trust itself. How do you rebuild faith in institutions after discovering that the most trusted members of your community were systematically harming children? How do you teach your children to respect authority while also teaching them to recognize and report abuse? The Cedar Hollow case changed how we approach child protection, explained Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who now heads the Vermont State Police's Crimes Against Children unit. We learned that predators don't operate in isolation. They create networks, they protect each other, and they specifically target communities with high levels of institutional trust. The investigation also revealed disturbing patterns in how predators identify and exploit vulnerable communities. Small towns with strong religious traditions, high levels of social cohesion, and residents who prefer to handle problems internally rather than involving outside authorities are particularly susceptible to this kind of systematic abuse. Predators are sophisticated in their understanding of social dynamics, Dr. Walsh continued. They know that tight-knit communities are more likely to protect their reputation than confront uncomfortable truths about trusted members. 10 years after the trials ended, I returned to Cedar Hollow to see how the community had evolved. Main Street was mostly empty, with half the storefronts showing for lease signs that had been there so long the sun had faded them white. Millie's diner was gone, replaced by a convenience store run by people who had moved to town after the scandal and knew nothing of its history. The house on Elm Street, where Thomas Ashford had lived, was torn down in 2004. The lot remains empty, though not for lack of buyers. Real estate agents report that potential purchasers invariably change their minds after learning the property's history. Local resident Susan Martinez, no relation, had lived in Cedar Hollow her entire life before the scandal broke. When I interviewed her in 2013, she was preparing to move to Florida. "I can't stay here anymore," she told me, gesturing around her living room at walls covered with family photos spanning generations. "Every time I walk down Main Street, I remember how we all trusted those men, how we invited them into our homes, let them around our children, how we defended them even after the evidence came out. Do you think the community could have prevented what happened? I think we chose not to see the signs because seeing them would have been too uncomfortable. There were whispers, strange observations, children who seemed afraid of certain adults. But it was easier to explain those things away than to consider the possibility that people we respected were monsters." She paused, staring at a photograph of her own. Children taken at a church picnic in 2002. Thomas Ashford was visible in the background, helping to serve food to families, with a smile that now looked sinister in hindsight. The worst part is that we became complicit through our willful ignorance. Those children suffered for years while we chose to believe that nothing bad could happen in our perfect little town. The victims of the Cedar Hollow ring are adults now, dealing with the long-term consequences of childhood trauma. Some have found healing through therapy and support groups. Others continue to struggle with the psychological scars left by their experiences. Several have spoken publicly about their experiences, hoping to educate other communities about the warning signs they wish the adults in their lives had recognized and acted upon. "People need to understand that predators don't look like monsters," said Jennifer, not her real name, who was abused by the ring between the ages of 7 and 9. "They look like your neighbor, your teacher, your pastor. They're the adults, who seem extra caring, who always volunteer to help with children, who make themselves indispensable to families and communities. What do you want people to learn from what happened to you? Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, investigate it. Don't assume that someone's reputation protects them from suspicion. And most importantly, believe children when they try to tell you something is wrong, even if they can't articulate exactly what it is. Thomas Ashford died in prison in 2019 at the age of 70. His death was attributed to complications from diabetes, though some investigators suspect he may have been targeted by other inmates who learned the nature of his crimes. His journal, found in his cell after his death, contained entries written right up until his final days. Even facing the end of his life, he continued to rationalize his actions and plan for what he called continuing his work through the materials he had created. "My legacy will outlive me," he wrote in one of his final entries. "The children I loved will carry that love with them forever, even if society has taught them to call it something ugly. One day, the world will understand that what we shared was beautiful." He was wrong, of course. His legacy is one of shattered innocence, broken trust, and a community that learned too late that evil can hide behind the most familiar faces. But there is another legacy from the Cedar Hollow case, a new understanding of how predators operate in communities, improved training for teachers and social workers to recognize signs of abuse, and stronger systems for investigating reports of child maltreatment. Most importantly, there is a growing recognition that protecting children requires community-wide vigilance and a willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about the people we trust. If you stayed with us through this difficult journey into institutional betrayal, leave a comment with the word protect so we know you understand why these stories must be told, no matter how much they hurt to hear, because somewhere tonight, in small towns and big cities across the world, there are children who are being systematically abused by the adults they trust most. There are communities choosing willful ignorance over uncomfortable truth. There are predators hiding behind reputations and institutional positions, counting on our reluctance to believe the worst about familiar faces. The children of Cedar Hollow paid the price for their community's failure to protect them. Their suffering serves as a warning that we ignore at the peril of the next generation. As I write this, more than 20 years after the Cedar Hollow case broke, I still receive calls from small towns dealing with similar scandals. The details vary, but the pattern remains consistent. Trusted community members systematically exploiting children while entire towns choose not to see what's happening in front of them. Crime 5. The Watchers in the Woods. Let me take you to the autumn of 2007. To the Blackwood National Forest in northern Montana, where the trees grow so thick that noon feels like twilight, and where I learned that some hunts never truly end. The call came on a Tuesday that felt like the world's last day, the sky heavy, with clouds that seemed to press down on the earth, like a lid on a coffin. I was working out of the Missoula field office then, having transferred from Vermont after the Cedar Hollow case left me questioning whether I could continue investigating crimes against children. The Montana wilderness felt like a place where I could find peace, where the vastness of untouched nature might wash away the memories of institutional evil and human betrayal. I was wrong, of course. Some places don't offer peace. They offer only deeper darkness. "Detective Martinez," said Sheriff Linda Crawford, her voice tight with something I couldn't identify over the phone. "We need you up at Blackwood. We've got missing hikers, and the circumstances are, unusual." How unusual? The kind that makes experienced search and rescue teams refuse to go back into the woods. The Blackwood National Forest covered over 2 million acres of pristine wilderness, home to grizzly bears, mountain lions, and wolves. But it was also home to something else, something that the local Native American tribes had been warning people about 4 generations. The Lakota called them Wanagi Oyat, the ghost people. The Crow knew them as Boshtil, the Watchers. Every tribe in the region had different names for them, but the descriptions were remarkably consistent. Tall, pale figures that moved through the forest with unnatural silence, watching travelers from the shadows and taking those who wandered too far from marked trails. For decades, park rangers had attributed the legends to natural predators, harsh weather conditions, and the tendency of human imagination to create monsters when faced with the unknown. Missing hikers were usually found days or weeks later, victims of falls, exposure, or animal attacks. But in the fall of 2007, something changed in the Blackwood Forest. Hikers began disappearing at an unprecedented rate, and the ones who were found defied every conventional explanation. I arrived at the Forest Service station on a Wednesday morning that felt like a funeral. The building, normally bustling with rangers and visitors, stood nearly empty. A single park ranger, Tom Whitehorse, sat behind the information desk, his weathered face etched with lines that seemed to have appeared overnight. "Detective Martinez?" he asked, rising slowly as if the effort pained him. "Thank God you're here. We need someone from outside to make sense of what's happening." Tom Whitehorse was 3/4 Crow, a man who had worked in Blackwood for over 20 years and knew every trail, every stream, every dangerous crossing in the vast forest. He was also the only ranger still willing to enter the woods. "Tell me about the disappearances," I said, pulling out my notebook. "Started in September," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper, despite the empty building. "First was the Henderson family from Colorado. Husband, wife, 2 teenage kids. They were experienced hikers, well-equipped, following marked trails. They disappeared on day 2 of what should have been a week-long camping trip. Any trace of them. That's the thing." Tom's hands shook as he spread a topographical map across the counter. "We found their campsite exactly as they left it. Tents still pitched, food still hanging from the bare cables. Personal items arranged like they'd just stepped away for a few minutes." "What about tracks? Signs of struggle?" "Nothing. It was like they just ... evaporated." Over the next hour, Tom described 8 more disappearances that followed the same pattern. Experienced hikers, well prepared for wilderness camping, vanishing without a trace from campsites that showed no signs of violence or hurried departure. But it was the found hikers that truly terrified him. "Last week, we discovered Maria Santos from the missing Albuquerque group," Tom continued, his voice growing quieter with each word. "She was sitting by Miller Creek, 3 miles from where her group had been camping. Just sitting there in the water, fully clothed, staring at nothing. Hypothermia. That's what we thought at first. But she'd only been missing for 18 hours, and the weather was mild. When the paramedics got to her, her body temperature was normal. No signs of exposure or dehydration." "What did she say happened to her group?" Tom's expression darkened. "That's the problem. She couldn't remember anything after the first night of camping. Complete retrograde amnesia covering the entire time she was missing." But Detective, he leaned closer, his voice barely audible. "She kept talking about the tall ones and the watching place. The medical evaluation of Maria." Santos revealed details that chilled me more than any crime scene I'd ever investigated. She was physically unharmed, but psychologically shattered, displaying symptoms of severe trauma without any apparent cause. Brain scans showed unusual activity in regions associated with fear, memory, and temporal processing, as if her mind was trying to remember and forget something simultaneously. "I've never seen anything like it," admitted Dr. Sarah Kim, the psychiatrist treating Maria at Missoula General Hospital. "She exhibits classic PTSD symptoms, but she can't remember the traumatic event. It's as if something deliberately scrubbed specific memories from her mind while leaving the emotional damage intact." "Is that possible?" "Not with any known psychiatric condition or drug, but something happened to her out there. Something so traumatic that her mind may have essentially shut down those neural pathways as a protective mechanism." Under hypnosis, Maria's fragmented memories revealed glimpses of her missing time that defied rational explanation. She described being led through the forest by tall figures that moved without making sound, walking in perfect formation toward what she called the watching place. She spoke of trees that seemed to move when she wasn't looking directly at them, and of whispers in a language that predated human speech. But most disturbing were her descriptions of the other missing hikers. They were there, she said during one hypnosis session, her voice flat and emotionless. All of them. The Henderson family, the couple from Oregon, the solo hiker from Texas. They were sitting in rows, like they were in church, but they weren't. They weren't themselves anymore. What do you mean? Their eyes were empty, like someone had taken out whatever made them human and left just the shells behind. They kept turning to look at me, all at the same time, but they weren't really seeing me. They were seeing through me, to something standing behind me. The investigation took a disturbing turn when we discovered that Maria Santos wasn't the first survivor. Over the past 5 years, 7 other hikers had been found in similar conditions, physically unharmed but psychologically devastated, with no memory of their time in the woods and recurring nightmares about tall watchers and empty-eyed people. All of them had been found near water sources, sitting motionlessly as if waiting for something. All of them described the same hypnotic visions under regression therapy, and all of them, within 6 months of their rescue, had taken their own lives. There's a pattern here, I told Sheriff Crawford as we reviewed the case files in her office. Something in that forest is targeting hikers, taking some permanently and returning others as messengers? Maybe? Warnings. You think we're dealing with a serial killer operating in the wilderness? I wanted to believe that. A human predator would be horrible, but at least comprehensible. I don't know what we're dealing with. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Dr. James Crowfeather, a cultural anthropologist from the University of Montana who specialized in Native American oral traditions. He contacted our office after reading about the disappearances in local newspapers. Detective Martinez, he said when we met at a coffee shop in Missoula, I need to tell you things that will sound impossible, but which my grandfather's grandfather knew to be true. Dr. Crowfeather was a tall, lean man in his 60s, with silver hair braided down his back and eyes that seemed to hold centuries of accumulated wisdom. He spread old photographs and photocopied documents across our table like a historian presenting evidence of forgotten civilizations. The Blackwood Forest has been a forbidden place for our people for over 300 years, he began. Not because of natural dangers, but because of what lives there, what has always lived there. According to the oral histories he had spent decades collecting, the Blackwood area had been home to something the tribes simply called the Tall Ones, beings that existed alongside humans but remained separate from them, following rules and motivations that predated human understanding. They're not spirits or ghosts in the way white culture understands such things, Dr. Crowfeather explained. They single quotes read ... older. They were here when the first humans crossed the land bridge from Asia, and they watched us learn to make fire, to use tools, to form societies. They've been watching us ever since. What do they want? To understand us, to study us the way we might study insects or small animals. Sometimes they take specimens for closer examination. Sometimes they return them when the research is complete. The historical records he showed me documented similar disappearances dating back to the 1800s, when the first European settlers entered the Blackwood region. Hunting parties that vanished without trace. Trappers found weeks later with no memory of their missing time. Trading posts that were discovered empty, with meals still warm on tables, and no signs of violence or hurried departure. The pattern has been consistent for over 2 centuries, Dr. Crowfeather said. But something has changed recently. The disappearances are increasing, and the returned ones are more damaged than they used to be. Why? Because we're changing. Human society, human technology, human impact on the environment. The Tall Ones are trying to understand what we're becoming, and their methods are becoming more invasive. If you're still with us for this final descent into the unknown, hit that subscribe button one last time, because what I'm about to tell you will challenge everything you believe about the nature of reality itself. Armed with Dr. Crowfeather's historical context, I decided to enter the Blackwood Forest myself, against the advice of Sheriff Crawford. the Park Service, and every rational instinct first possessed. I packed camping gear and hiking equipment for a 3-day solo expedition into the area where most disappearances had occurred. "This is insane," Tom Whitehorse told me as he checked my emergency radio one final time. "No one goes into the deep woods alone anymore. Not since the disappearances started. Someone has to investigate this properly. If there's a human predator out there, we need evidence. If there's something else, ... I shrugged, trying to project confidence I didn't feel. "We need to know what we're dealing with." Tom studied my face for a long moment. "If you insist on doing this, there are protocols my people have followed for generations. Rules that might keep you safe." The protocols were simple but specific. Travel only during daylight hours. Never follow sounds that seem to come from human voices. Avoid any area where the normal forest sounds stop completely. And never, under any circumstances, look directly at the tall figures if you see them watching from the tree line. Why not look at them? Because once they know you can see them, they'll take interest in you. And once they take interest, ... He shrugged. "Well, you've seen what happens to people they find interesting." I entered the Blackwood Forest on a Friday morning that felt like stepping into a cathedral made of shadows. The trees grew so thick that the sky disappeared within 100 yards of the trailhead, and the only sounds were my footsteps on the pine needle carpet and the occasional call of birds I couldn't identify. For the first day, nothing unusual occurred. I hiked deeper into the forest than any of the missing groups had traveled, setting up camp near a crystal-clear stream that reflected the canopy above like a mirror of green glass. I prepared dinner, documented my observations in a field journal, and settled into my sleeping bag. As darkness fell like a physical weight, that's when the watching began. I can't say exactly when I first became aware of them. It was more of a feeling than a visual observation. The sense of eyes tracking my movement from the darkness beyond my campfire's glow. Not the casual attention of wildlife, but focused, intelligent observation. I followed Tom's protocols and didn't look directly toward the sensation, but my peripheral vision caught glimpses of impossibly tall, pale shapes moving between the trees with fluid silence. They seemed to be studying me, analyzing my behavior with the same clinical detachment I might use to observe evidence at a crime scene. The second night, they came closer. I woke to the sound of my campfire crackling, but when I opened my eyes, the fire had died hours ago. The crackling sound was coming from something else. Footsteps on dry leaves, circling my tent in a slow, methodical pattern. Through the thin nylon walls, I could see shadows moving past my tent. Tall shadows, too. Tall to be human, moving with a grace that seemed to ignore the laws of physics. They would appear on one side of my tent, pause for a moment, as if examining something, then flow to another position without the transitional movement that normal locomotion requires. I lay perfectly still, controlling my breathing, following the protocols that were supposed to keep me safe. Don't look directly. Don't acknowledge their presence. Don't show fear. But it was impossible not to be afraid when something that shouldn't exist was studying you like a laboratory specimen. On the third morning, I awoke to find changes in my campsite that made my blood run cold. My backpack had been moved approximately 6 inches to the left. My hiking boots were facing the opposite direction from where I had left them. My journal lay open to a page I hadn't written on, with symbols drawn in what appeared to be ash from my dead campfire. The symbols looked almost like mathematical equations or scientific notations, but rendered in a script that seemed to bend and shift when I tried to focus on it. Looking at them directly caused a strange disorientation, as if they were describing concepts my human brain wasn't equipped to process. More disturbing was the realization that someone or something had been in my tent while I slept, close enough to touch me. Examining my belongings and leaving evidence of their presence, I broke camp immediately and began hiking toward the exit trail. But the forest had changed overnight. Paths that had been clearly marked the day before now branched in directions that weren't on my topographical maps. Streams flowed uphill. The sun appeared to be shining from the north, and everywhere I looked, just at the edge of my peripheral vision, the tall figures followed me. They seemed to be herding me, subtly directing my path towards something deeper. In the forest, when I tried to turn back toward what should have been the exit trail, I would find impassable terrain that hadn't existed the day before. When I followed the path they seemed to want me to take, the way forward was always clear. By afternoon, I realized I was completely lost in a forest I had studied extensively before entering. Nothing looked familiar. The trees seemed taller, more densely packed, and the shadows between them moved independently of the wind. That's when I found the watching place. It was a circular clearing approximately 50 yards in diameter, surrounded by trees that formed perfect concentric rings, as if they had been planted rather than grown naturally. In the center of the clearing was a series of stone formations that looked both ancient and deliberately constructed, not quite structures, but not random geological formations either, and sitting among the stones, arranged in neat rows, like students in a classroom, were the missing hikers. The Henderson family sat in the front row, their backs perfectly straight, their hands folded in their laps. Behind them were the couple from Oregon, the solo hiker from Texas, and others I recognized from missing person reports. They all faced the same direction, towards something at the far end of the clearing that my eyes couldn't quite focus on. All of them appeared physically unharmed. Their clothes were clean, their hair combed, their faces peaceful, but their eyes held the empty quality Maria Santos had described. Not dead, but not alive in any meaningful sense, as if the essential spark that made them human had been carefully removed and filed away for future study. When I entered the clearing, they all turned to look at me in perfect unison, their movements synchronized with mechanical precision. Their faces showed no recognition, no fear, no hope for rescue. They simply observed me, with the same detached interest I had felt from the tall figures. At the far end of the clearing, where the seated hikers had been facing, 3 of the tall figures stood motionless. They were even more unsettling to see, directly humanoid but wrong, as if someone had tried to recreate human anatomy from incomplete descriptions. Too tall, too pale, with limbs that bent at angles that violated human physiology. But it was their faces that nearly shattered my sanity. They had features that suggested eyes, nose, and mouth, but arranged in proportions that created a sense of profound wrongness. Looking at them directly caused a disorientation similar to the symbols in my journal. My brain seemed incapable of processing what I was seeing. One of them approached me with movements that seemed to skip intermediate positions, appearing closer without the transition of walking. It stopped approximately 10 feet away and regarded me with an expression that might have been curiosity. When it spoke, the words formed directly in my mind rather than being heard through my ears. You are different from the others. Your mind carries memories of violence, of darkness, deliberately sought. You hunt predators among your own kind. The voice was neither male nor female, neither young nor old, but somehow ancient beyond human comprehension. We have watched your species for many generations, it continued. You have become interesting to us as you develop new forms of cruelty, new methods of causing suffering to your own kind. We collect specimens to understand this evolution. I found my voice, though it came out as barely a whisper. What are you? We are what your people call watchers. We observe, we study, we preserve examples of behavior patterns that intrigue us. Your species has been our most fascinating subject. Why are you taking people? Because you are changing rapidly now. Your capacity for evil grows more sophisticated with each generation. We must document these changes before they evolve beyond our ability to comprehend. The entity gestured toward the seated hikers. These specimens represent baseline human psychology, normal individuals living conventional lives. But you, It seemed to lean closer, without moving. You have chosen to swim in darkness. You seek out the evil your species creates and try to understand it. This makes you a valuable specimen. I realized with growing horror that this thing, whatever it was, viewed human evil not as an aberration to be stopped, but as an evolutionary development to be studied. Our worst crimes weren't moral failures to them, they were research data. The ones you return, I said, thinking of Maria Santos and the others who had killed themselves. Why do you let them go? They serve as, how do you say, control groups? We return them with damaged memories, so we can observe how your society responds to trauma, without context. Their subsequent self-destruction provides additional data about human psychological fragility. The casual way it discussed driving people to suicide made my stomach turn. These beings weren't just kidnapping humans, they were conducting elaborate psychological experiments on our entire species, using individual lives as disposable test subjects. We have decided to add you to our permanent collection, the entity continued. Your experience with human darkness will provide valuable comparative data as we study how evil evolves in your species. I felt my mind beginning to shut down as the reality of my situation became clear. I was about to join the empty-eyed figures. Seated in the clearing, my consciousness filed away while my body became another data point in an alien research project. But something in my training kicked in. Perhaps the same instinct that had kept me alive through decades of hunting human predators. I reached slowly for the emergency flare in my hiking pack, the one Tom Whitehorse had insisted I carry. Wait, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. If you're studying human evil, you're missing the most important element. The entity paused, its terrible face tilting slightly. Explain. The best human predators don't just cause suffering, they document it. They take trophies, photographs, souvenirs. The act of preservation is part of their pathology. I thought of Marcus Delacroix and his photographs of murder victims. Without documentation, the evil isn't complete. I could sense the entity's interest intensifying. You possess such documentation. Thousands of cases. Crime scene photographs, victim testimonies, detailed analyses of the most depraved acts humans commit against each other. Information that could help you understand our evolution toward greater cruelty. It was a desperate gamble, but it worked. The entity stepped back, communicating with its companions through means I couldn't perceive. After a moment that felt like an eternity, it addressed me again. We will consider a trade. Your documentation of human evil in exchange for your freedom. I need to return to civilization to retrieve the files, I said, hardly daring to believe. This might work. They're stored in secure databases, encrypted files that only I can access. Another pause for inhuman consultation. You will return within 1 lunar cycle. If you attempt to bring others or fail to provide the promised documentation, we will collect not just you, but everyone you have worked with over your career. The threat was clear. Comply, or watch my colleagues and friends join the empty-eyed specimens in this cursed clearing. I understand, I said. The entity approached me one final time, and I felt a sensation like ice water flooding my skull as it touched my mind directly. We have marked you now. No matter where you go, we will know your location. Do not disappoint us. The world went black. I woke up at the Forest Service station, lying on a bench outside the building with no memory of how I had gotten there. Tom Whitehorse found me at dawn, dehydrated and disoriented but physically unharmed, according to the timestamp on my emergency radio's GPS. I had been missing for only 6 hours, though my memory suggested I had been in the forest for 3 days. What happened out there? Tom asked, but I couldn't answer him. Not then, and not now, all these years later, because I had made a deal with something that shouldn't exist, and I spent the next month fulfilling my part of the bargain. I compiled everything: case files, crime scene photographs, psychological profiles, behavioral analyses, from 15 years of investigating human evil. I encrypted it all onto portable drives and returned to the Blackwood Forest. Exactly 29 days after my first encounter, the tall figures were waiting for me at the edge of the clearing. I left the drives on a stone formation and walked away without looking back. Behind me, I could hear sounds that might have been satisfaction or anticipation. I never returned to the Blackwood Forest, and I resigned from law enforcement the following week. The official reason was early retirement due to stress, but the truth was that I could no longer investigate human evil, knowing that somewhere, something was using my work to study us like insects in a display case. If you've made it through this final story with me, leave a comment with the word watched, so I know there are others out there who've heard these truths and survived the telling. The disappearances in Blackwood Forest stopped after I made my trade. The missing hikers were never found, but no new cases were reported. The forest returned to its previous pattern of occasional, explainable disappearances due to natural hazards. But sometimes, late at night, I receive files in my email: crime scene photographs, case reports, investigative analyses from ongoing cases around the world. Files I never requested, sent from addresses that don't exist, documenting new forms of human cruelty that someone, somewhere, is very interested in cataloging. The watchers in the woods are gone, but they haven't stopped watching. They've just found more efficient methods of data collection. And sometimes, when I'm walking alone on city streets or sitting in crowded restaurants, I feel that familiar sensation of being observed with scientific detachment, the presence of something that sees humans not as individuals with inherent worth, but as specimens in an ongoing behavioral study. We are all being watched, documented, analyzed by intelligences that view our worst impulses not as moral failures, but as evolutionary developments worthy of preservation and study. Every act of cruelty, every moment of suffering, every descent into darkness becomes another data point in their vast research project. The cases I've shared with you over these 5 nights: the Hartwell family, Marcus Delacroix, Patricia Henley, the Cedar Hollow ring, and finally, the Watchers themselves. They're all connected by a common thread. They represent humanity's capacity for evil, documented and preserved by someone or something that finds our darkest impulses fascinating rather than horrifying. We create monsters, and then we become the monsters we create. And somewhere in the shadows between civilization and wilderness, ancient eyes watch our transformation with the patience of beings who measure time in geological epochs rather than human generations. This has been our final night together with Criminal Nights. Thank you for joining me on these journeys into darkness, for listening to stories that others are afraid to tell, and for understanding that sometimes the most important truths are also the most terrible. Remember to keep your lights on, lock your doors, and stay on marked trails when you venture into wild places. But most importantly, remember that the most dangerous predators aren't the ones hiding in forests or abandoned buildings. They're the ones sitting at the next table in restaurants, teaching in our schools, working in our hospitals, and living in houses that look exactly like yours. Watch for them. Document what you see, and never forget that somewhere, something is watching you do the same thing. Until we meet again, in the darkness, this has been Criminal Nights. Good night, and sweet dreams.